Hello there, I'm Alex, and I sell cheese for a living. As a cheesemonger and certified cheese professional, I have helped thousands of customers find their favorite cheese. Each episode, I'll share what I've learned from behind the counter as we dive into the vast, fascinating world of all things cheese. This week, we take a look at the art, the comedy, and the comfort of cheese in culture, ranging from Renaissance paintings to melting clocks, famous phrases that you hear every day of your life. This episode, we're going to break down a little bit of what happens when people who enjoy cheese turn it into art or turn it into a piece of pop culture in general. At some point in human history, we looked at milk, a thing that spoils almost immediately, and said, what if we let it rot on purpose, stored it in caves, argued about it forever, and then made it a personality trait? Cheese shows up in a lot of places in our lives. It's food, obviously, but it also carries some memory, humor, and a little bit of identity. Cheese can show up in museums or memes, in sacred texts, and late-night fridge raids. It's been a survival food, a luxury item, a punchline, and a status symbol, sometimes all at the same time. Today isn't necessarily about how cheese is made or what pairs with it. It's going to be about where cheese shows up in the culture, in the art, the language, TVs, and movies, and why it keeps coming back into focus. Cheese starts its life not as indulgence, but kind of as insurance. Milk is fragile, spoils fast. Cheese is what happens when humans decide they want milk to last through winter, better for travel, easy to trade, and if you have some spare time. Early cheese wasn't fancy, it was dense, salty, durable, it was calories you could carry. We've said it all before, and that alone gave it power, but very quickly, cheese picked up symbolic weight. In Greek mythology, the god Aristaeus, son of Apollo, is said to have taught humans how to make cheese. That places cheesemaking alongside agriculture, beekeeping, and animal husbandry, not cooking, but part of their civilization story. In biblical texts, cheese appears as nourishment, tribute, and sustenance. It often travels alongside milk and honey, foods that are tied to abundance and promise. Cheese isn't described here as luxury, but it's not meaningless either. And then, as societies can stabilize, cheese starts showing up more in art. During the Dutch Golden Age, wheels of cheese appear in still lifes as symbols of wealth and trade. The Netherlands wasn't just eating cheese, it was exporting it, taxing it, building identity around it. But those aren't the only moments where cheese shows up visually. Cheese appears again and again in European genre painting. Scenes of markets, kitchens, taverns, and homes. In these paintings, cheese usually isn't the star. It's sitting on a table, hanging in the background, or even being cut mid-conversation. And I think that's the point, or at least part of the point. Artists use cheese to signal everyday life, abundance, or domestic order without having to explain it. In religious art, cheese occasionally appears in scenes tied to pastoral life or daily labor. It's not symbolic in a loud way, but it reinforces ideas of nourishment, work, and provision. As you move forward in time, cheese becomes more literal and sometimes more playful. If you've ever heard that the moon was made of cheese, you may have not known that that came from a popular English writer, John Haywood, from his 1546 collection of Proverbs. And it was originally used as a metaphor for gullibility, specifically the phrase, the moon is made of green cheese, which is to describe someone naive enough to believe a preposterous lie. Key medieval fables would often include Slavic and French influence, where a combination of animals would be tricked into believing the moon's reflection in a well was a wheel of cheese. If you can imagine a fox and a wolf being tricked to look down the well into the flat water and seeing the reflection of a full moon, and being told that at the bottom of the well was a whole wheel of new cheese. And all you had to do is jump into the well, drink up all the water, and then you could have that wheel of cheese. These were meant to show gullibility in the way of the animal being tricked. Of course, nobody would store a wheel of cheese at the bottom of a well. And also, as you put your hand in front of the moonlight, you should be able to tell, hey, that's just a shadow. But again, as early as 1546, people were making the correlation between wheels of cheese and the moon looking cheese-ish with all of its craters. Sculptural depictions of food in the 19th and 20th centuries start including cheese as part of still life installations and decorative arts. It shows up carved, molded, or cast, not because it's exotic, but because it's pretty familiar. In more contemporary art, cheese leans even harder into the familiarity. You'll see it in pop art influenced paintings, murals, and installations where food stands in for comfort, excess, or humor. Street art and murals sometimes use cheese as a character. Exaggerated wedges, dripping slices, cartoonish wheels, especially in cities where food culture is part of a local identity. And then there's the tattoo culture. Cheese tattoos are surprisingly common, usually done with humor. They're playful, iconic, or nostalgic. People aren't getting cheese tattooed because it's rare or elite. They're getting it because it's personal. And I can attest to that. I have my own cheese tattoo that I'm very proud of. Across all these examples, the role of cheese stays pretty consistent. It's recognizable, it doesn't need explanation. Artists can drop it into a scene and trust that the viewer already understands what kind of world they're looking at. That's the moment where cheese shifts from being mainly practical to something people actively want. Cheese does a lot of quiet social work. It's one of the few foods that shows up reliably whenever people gather. Not because anyone sat down and planned it that way, but because cheese solves a bunch of social problems all at once. If you're hosting and you don't know exactly what people like, cheese is a pretty safe move. It doesn't require reheating, it works at room temperature, most people can at least eat some form of it, and it doesn't ask for much explanation. That's why cheese ends up on tables at parties, holidays, meetings, and casual get-togethers. It fills space without demanding attention. People can graze, talk, circle back, and then move on. There's also an unspoken range built into cheese. You can grab a block at the grocery store, or you can stop at a specialty shop. Either way, the gesture reads the same. You thought about feeding your guests. Cheese also becomes a way of signaling care without making a speech about it. It also handles social variety well. Different textures, different flavors, different levels of intensity, all on the same board. People self-select. No one has to commit. No one has to justify their choice. That flexibility is a big part of why cheese sticks around culturally. It fits into a lot of situations without taking them over. And once a food becomes part of gatherings, routines, and shared moments, it starts carrying a lot more meaning than just calories alone would suggest. In America, industrialization changes everything. Refrigeration, railroads, and mass production allowed cheese to travel farther and live longer than ever before. But in the United States especially, cheese took on a new role. During the 20th century, American dairy production explodes. Government subsidies, surplus milk, and wartime logistics all push cheese towards shelf stability and consistency. Processed cheese isn't an accident, it's the solution. I've said it in previous episodes, but it melts reliably, it lasts quite a bit longer, it can feed soldiers, and it fed kids. And somewhere between World War II and the suburban expansion, cheese becomes closely tied to routine and familiarity. I mean, just look at grilled cheese, mac and cheese, casseroles, pizzas. Cheese becomes the flavor of home-cooked meals. This is also where language starts to change because once something is everywhere, it stops being special. And when it stops being special, we start joking about it. Cheese is visually kind of funny. It melts, it stretches, kind of stinks, it oozes. There's a lot of fun words you can tie to cheese, and depending on the block or wedge or wheel, you're probably going to be correct, and most people will have a shared understanding of what you're describing. One of the best visuals in art that I can think of that is directly inspired by cheese is a story of when Salvador Dali was watching a camembert cheese melting in the sun after a dinner. The surreal image, combined with his desire to represent the fluid and subjective nature of time in dreams, led to all of his drooping clocks. I've seen a couple places now where he talked about, or they had references to, all of those melting clocks in Dali's paintings started with him watching some camembert melt. Now, it kind of looks a little cartoony, and that leads to the next part of cartoons. They understand cheese immediately. All the visuals are extremely relatable and very built for cartoons. Look at Tom and Jerry. Cheese is desire, it's bait, it's danger, it's a reward. The cheese itself barely matters, but it's the object everything revolves around. The mouse wants the cheese. The cat uses the cheese as bait. If we were to look at Wallace and Gromit, they took this a little bit further. Wallace's obsession with cheese becomes a personality trait and a national stereotype, as well as a running gag. It's so effective that sales of Wensleydale cheese reportedly surged after that show aired. In The Simpsons, cheese shows up constantly as excess, comfort, and indulgence. Homer doesn't savor cheese, he consumes it. And I think that's part of the joke. Over time, This repetition makes cheese feel ordinary and recognizable. Once something reaches that level of familiarity, it tends to show up in language, and it kind of lives in how we talk. Cheese doesn't just live on plates. Let's start with the obvious one. If you've ever heard someone say, "Oh, that's cheesy," originally, cheesy meant something that was cheap, showy, or artificial. And that meaning didn't come from artisan cheddar. It came from processed sameness, the predictable cheeses, the overdone, overeaten, manufactured emotion of sameness. A cheesy movie, cheesy joke. It's a little too much, a little too obvious, a little too fake. So that was a pretty common one. Next is going to be the big cheese, meaning the important person. It could be your boss. It could be someone who's in charge. It could be your best bud. That phrase likely comes from cheese being associated with wealth, abundance, and power, especially in societies where cheese production meant land and livestock. If you had a lot of cheese, you could have been the big cheese. And I can't tell you how many times a week I get called the big cheese, and I don't have that much land and I don't have any livestock, but it sticks. Another one, cheese it, meaning stop, run, scatter, possibly tied to early American slang and street culture. But again, cheese is shorthand for something everyone recognizes instantly. Then look at how dairy animals show up in language. You have something untouchable, almost above criticism. You could call that a sacred cow. If you had a reliable source of income, that could be a cash cow. If you were to extract value repeatedly, you would be using a phrase like milk it for all it's worth. And the best part of anything that rises to the top is going to be the cream of the crop. As the cream rises, the best part. And if you were to lubricate someone's ego in the form of flattery, you would be buttering someone up. Even the word curdle can get emotional. A voice can curdle, a mood can curdle. Spoiled milk and curdling ends up standing in for discomfort or tension. What's fascinating is that almost none of these phrases are neutral. Dairy language is emotional. It's evaluative, and it's above value. It's all about excess, waste, purity, and reward. All of this turns cheese into a useful shorthand for everyday language. Eventually, cheese gets so common that people stop thinking about it at all. By the late 20th century, cheese was everywhere, pre-sliced, pre-shredded, largely interchangeable. And for a lot of people, cheese just became a background ingredient, something you grabbed without asking where it came from or why it tasted the way it did. And when that happens with food, there's usually a reaction. People start looking for something that feels more specific, more intentional, something with a story attached. And that's where the artisan cheese movement really began to gain traction. From small producers, farmstead operations, and cheesemakers who are willing to talk openly about their animals, their land, and their process, not only because it's trendy at first, but because it feels like a correction. At the same time, the role of the cheesemonger changes. Instead of just selling cheese, they start explaining it, translating it, giving people language for why one cheese costs more than another, or why two things that look similar taste completely different, or starting a podcast to talk about cheese and explain the wide range of artisan cheeses to a larger community. I wonder who could do that. I forget the post, if it was a meme or if it was an article, but there was a person who was giving some company the business for, they posted the names of all their dairy cows. I don't know if it was a milk or a cheese. And all of the dairy cow names were female. And the person commenting was saying how it was almost sexist to give all the cows feminine names, whereas, they're trying to appeal to a more dainty or less masculine product, as it was, a dairy-based item. And the number of comments below were that of, it's really hard to get milk from a bull. And I think that was an interesting look at some of the education that needs to happen in this country and in the world of, dairy animals, farm animals, cheese, everything related. Some people just don't fully know that you get milk from girl cows. And we start there and go on. That is a big part of the current monger relationship with the customers and with the communities they live in. Our cheesemongers have to kind of start at the beginning and really explain from the beginning of where milk comes from to how it becomes a piece of cheese that they're trying to sell at their counter. What I just described was something I saw on social media weeks or months ago. And since then, it's kind of been on my mind that social media, when it shows up, it speeds everything up. This shouldn't come as a surprise. Social media runs most people's day-to-day lives. But again, cheese is visual. You know, when it melts, it looks interesting. The textures are interesting. Cheese boards can become a way of signaling taste or curiosity, a little bit of leisure. And anymore, if you have a cell phone, you don't just eat cheese, you show it off. You take a picture, you throw it up on Instagram, you send it to your friends on a Snapchat or whatever social media exists. And during moments when things feel uncertain, economic downturns, long stressful news cycles, big global events, cheese tends to surge in popularity. People will go out and buy the comfort foods when they feel the most stressed. And this can easily be, you know, big casseroles, lasagnas, meatloafs, home cooked meal kind of foods. But a lot of that can also be the calorie dense, rich, welcoming cheese. And that kind of combination of familiarity plus a good background, a good story behind it is kind of what brought cheese back into focus. It rebranded itself as being more important than just a staple in culture. It needed to be talked about again, as it was when it was being invented for the first time. I think cheese sticks around because it adapts easily. No matter what's happening in the world, there's a cheese for it. There's a cheese related story that can help you get by. And it can be sacred or it can be silly. Cheese can be cheap or luxurious, and it can be industrial or quite intimate. Few foods live comfortably in museums, memes, lunchboxes, comedy sketches, and Michelin star kitchens all at the same time. Cheese does. And that's why we keep coming back to it. Not just to eat it, but to talk about it, to joke about it, and build more meaning around it. Somewhere along the way, cheese became part of everyday culture. And when you look at where the cheese shows up in art, language, TV, tables, memes, phones, etc., it's clear that it's doing more than just filling space on a plate. It's part of how people gather, how they relax, and how they make things feel more normal. And I would say that's probably why it keeps coming back, no matter how much food culture changes. Thank you for listening to this week's somewhat pop culture-based cheese episode. I hope it wasn't too cheesy for you. I can't believe I went this whole time with talking about culture and pop culture and not talking about all of the cheese puns that exist. There are thousands. I hear them every week. If you want a good laugh, go look them up yourself. A wise animal once said, "It ain't easy being cheesy." I'm Alex, and this has been The Modern Monger.